Protests against Israel's bombing and invasion of Gaza continue around the world, including in Canada. Journalist Camila Escalante has been in Toronto for the past week, covering the protests in our neighbor to the north, and we spoke with her via Skype on Friday about what she's seen.
Well, the protests are continuing, which is really impressive. These sorts of things have a tendency to start and then, people get demotivated. The pressure stops being mounted on politicians. They start doing other things enter the headlines. But in this case, we're seeing a lot of pressure mounted on elected officials. Last night, I went to the exterior of the offices of one of the members of parliament, and there have been protests that are demanding that Canadian members of parliament pressure Justin Trudeau to call for a ceasefire. It's actually a very simple demand. They're not going further than that, but we've seen all sorts of actions like that. There have been other actions, other disruptions, such as shutting down and blocking weapons manufacturers or weapons parts manufacturers, of which there are many around Canada, and also the mass demonstrations that we've been seeing continue here in Toronto, of course, against the slaughter and genocide of Palestinians by the Zionist Israelis, but also, calling on the Trudeau government to do more in the United Nations, but also to withdraw all of its support for Israel, stop the transfer of arms, stop the transfer of technology and everything that's contributing to the ongoing genocide. And so those are the sorts of things we're seeing. That I normally cover Latin America, and just as well in Latin America, we've seen a lot of calls for countries to break ties with Israel, to completely sever ties, not just make these little gestures of protest, diplomatic protest, and recalling their diplomats, but to actually do the thing and cut ties altogether with Israel. And so we haven't actually seen any countries do that besides Bolivia and Belize, which was welcome news this week. Of course, Belize announced that they're withdrawing their diplomat from Tel Aviv, and also kicking out the Israeli diplomat from Belize. And so that was a welcome piece of news, but we haven't really seen or heard much else from those other progressive governments who've been threatening to cut ties with Israel, but so far have not around Latin America.
It's interesting. I wonder how much more effective pressure might be on members of parliament up there. I mean, there's been sort of a steady erosion of legitimacy. First, the way that Trudeau and Parliament treated the truckers, was it 2 years ago now, I guess, and then this incident with the SS guy and Zelensky back earlier this year. There's a few hits in front of both the Canadian population and the world that the senior government officials of Parliament and the Prime Minister have taken. And so I wonder if they're feeling the pressure now even more because they're kind of standing on shaky ground already.
Well, precisely that. People think that this government is already very illegitimate for the reasons that you said, because of the handling of COVID-19, because of, the way in which they approached those protests having to do with the vaccines 2 years ago. But also, Stephen Harper, the former prime minister here in Canada, actually left with extraordinarily low approval rating. He saw his approval rating decline, and a lot of activists and protesters were mounting pressure on him on a number of issues in his final days, and that really sealed the deal. I think people are thinking now that sort of thing can happen with Justin Trudeau. These are way bigger protests than anything that Harper had to deal with. And so we saw this week as well some pro-Palestine protesters spring up on Justin Trudeau, who was eating at a fancy restaurant. And of course, they called for a ceasefire as well. And those sorts of actions have been taking place against other elected officials, not just MPs, the mayor of Toronto as well. And so these people are over time losing a lot of legitimacy. I mean, we're dealing with inflation, high cost of living, and all sorts of other issues here as well that people have on their minds at the same time. And then they're also seeing the failure to respond to these issues. Canada, of course, last week, I believe, in the General Assembly, they tried to pass some sort of amendment on a draft resolution, saying that they, essentially sided with Israel because they didn't want to vote in favor of the resolution that was penned by Jordan that was calling for an end to the killing. And so people are seeing what Canada's role is as the sort of lapdog of the United States without its own independent foreign policy. And, he's just losing support all around. He, of course, won a minority government, and he's just being propped up by another party, the NDP, a very smaller sort of left of center party. And so it's going to be very difficult, I think, for these people to be elected in the future. What we're hearing people say at these protests is that they will not be supporting any candidate who doesn't take the right side on this Israel-Palestine issue.
Here in the United States, of course, we've got a very strong Israel lobby, AIPAC, and some others. Is there something analogous to that in Canada? And is there some organized counter to that that manifests anywhere visible?
Yes, there are. Of course, there are lots of Zionist groups, including campus groups at the various universities that try to stifle any pro-Palestinian advocacy or activism or organizing on campus. Just in society in general, there are numerous Zionist groups who provide funding, again, for universities, also for all sorts of other things. There have been a number of Canadian companies listed as part of sort of the BDS campaign that people are now boycotting, specifically certain businesses that have taken a very public pro-Israel stance. And there's also those sorts of lists that exist in the U.S., the Canary list, and also there's an organization called Honest Reporting that's also in the United States, but exists here in Canada, where they go around policing everything everyone says about Palestine and Israel and also Iran. And they have been going after even the mainstream news at this point because they want total censorship of anything that is pro-Palestine and anything that's telling the truth about what's taking place here. This is already a country that has tried to implement a lot of different measures to ensure that there is censorship, to ensure that people don't know what's going on. And we've seen this with a number of issues, but particularly right now, the mainstream media doesn't feel like giving equal airtime to those voices who are calling for an end to the slaughter and genocide. So that's what's taking place here. Today, there's going to be another action that I'm heading out to today. Huge protests and actions taking place in the following days. And next week, there's going to be a grand national march on Ottawa.
So elsewhere, like on the West Coast, and any reports on any of the stuff there? Also, Montreal, or anywhere in Quebec.
Yes, in all of the major cities, there have been very large mobilizations, and I should say that there has been a lot of participation from First Nations, from Indigenous peoples all over the country, who say that the sort of settler occupation that the Palestinians are resisting against, that they're fighting against, is the same struggle that people continue to face here, that Canada has a horrible, dark history of genocide and colonialism, which people are continuing to fight because they have not ceded their territories, and the Canadian state is continuing to infringe on their traditional Indigenous territories alongside their multinational and obviously Canadian-based corporations and extractivist operations that are trying to remove and displace and wipe out what remains of the Indigenous peoples of these lands. Those people have been taking part in these protests and saying that it's one struggle and that everybody else needs to wake up to the reality that people here on the American continent, including in the U.S., continue to face violent repression from state forces and removal and displacement from their lands, and that's ongoing. They say it's the same thing that's being experienced in Gaza and the West Bank is being experienced by communities here.
Interesting, because you have at the same time South Africa saying, and by the way, we know apartheid and Israel is an apartheid state. They'd have that common experience as well. Camila, thank you so much for your time. And as always, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Don. I'll talk to you next week.
Yep. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.